Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So, well, we've seen two big groups of presentation which talked a lot about people. So we've learned about the individual, we learned about growing population, about the fact that they were looking for meaning, and we know now that they are ready for work. So for the two next presentation, we will just gonna give them just what they need for work: food and energy. So let's start with energy. So all our business, all our economy requires energy. That's not something you think about every day for your day-to-day business. But imagine if you were to turn on the light and it's not there. It's a very important topic. And so I'd like you to think about for a while of what it should be in the future. Let's think from scratch. No past of energy, know what's happening now. How should the energy look like really in the future? Should it look like this? We don't think so. Why? Well, it's not that it's far away from your markets, from your business. It's more that it's insecure. We are not sure whether we will be able to access this source of energy for long. And by the way, those guys over there, although it's not in the price of your electricity or your energy, are very expensive to maintain. Should it look like this? Maybe not. This could be closer to your home. I'm from France. I have seen this happening on the coast of my country. And I don't think this is the right way for energy either. So this is not sustainable. This damages society. So in other words, we've tried to think about three axes for what energy should look like in the future. First, it should be sustainable. We are not talking here about environmentally only. We are talking about socially. And we are talking about quantity. We are saying, well, we would like it to last. We are thinking about security as well. We want our energy to be accessible anytime without any concern. We business people have other concerns to deal with. We just want to switch the light on. And finally, we want it to be affordable. This is part of our competitiveness in the country and in our businesses. So basically, we should have a mix of all that. Although until now, what we have seen is the top one, our dollars, so the cost of energy, which has been the big driver in how it shows which energy we would be using. So let's think a bit in the different way for the future. Rather than thinking of this big sign as a driver for our choice, let's think about it as a constraint. And then we can look at the two other axes and think, well, how would I choose my energy if I did not think first about cost? And when we look at the different types of energy that we have now, well, they do not fare that well. On the contrary, if we think about renewable energy, whether it's a new one, like wind or solar, or whether it's a bit older one, like hydroelectricity, well, they fare so much better. So really, if we do not think so much about cost, this looks like the ideal world. So in the future, is this really going to happen? Are we going to tend towards this scenario? Well, we looked at some trends from experts. And what we see, for example, from BP is that, yes, renewables are definitely growing, but they remain tiny compared to fossil fuels. We can look at other people and see exactly the same picture. Then, well, you will tell me maybe Shell and BP are a bit biased from this point of view. So we tried to look at other sources, and we found exactly the same kind of scenario, obviously with differences, with margin of error, but more or less, even consultants saying that, well, this is what the picture will look like in the future. So we wondered, well, if this is a consensus of energy, why is this ideal scenario not happening? Obviously, there is cost, which I left aside until now, but there is more than that, really. We are not starting from scratch. We are not saying, OK, let's make a new world of energy. We have to deal with reality. And what we see is that renewable energy, for example, have capacity issues. And when I mean capacity, I mean, do they have the capability to replace 100% all our needs? Also, we have need for new infrastructure. And again, I do not mean infrastructure as power plants. I also mean all our economy, which is currently geared toward fossil fuel. That's a big change. It requires a lot of investment. That's not easy to do. And finally, obviously, if I were an incumbent, I would try to protect my market. So there's a big gap between the consensus and what we see as the ideal scenario. And then what we did is that we decided to focus on one little item in the middle, which we thought was very interesting. Biofuels. Why biofuels? Well, we thought if renewable energy cannot really replace fossil fuel in the future, could a source of energy which is not faring that bad, in fact, start replacing the fossil fuel industry? I mean, we are still talking about fuel here. But when we look at what's happening in reality, in fact, biofuel is not developing very fast. In fact, when you compare this to the development of renewable energy, that's really slow as a growth of industry. And well, if you look at the production of biofuel, it has been growing quite fast, say from 2005 onward, and then recently it has been stagnating. And what we've seen at IND is that we recognize this more or less as an S-curve, like now it's plateauing. That raises question for us. From this S-curve, will it keep growing at some point, or will it stagnate? On the contrary, will it decrease? And to answer this question, well, we look at different trends. We look at what is the root cause behind all that? What's happening? And so we identified a few causes that we'd like to share with you. The first one is inherent to biofuel. We are talking about growing crops and taking what would otherwise had been used as food and making fuel from it. And this has a rather low yield. To make a small quantity of oil, you need large surface. You need land and you need water. In fact, what this graph shows is that in order to produce enough energy for all the needs that we have in the world, we would need basically to cover the whole world with plants to grow for biofuel. That's just not realistic. Why? Well, simply because we need the land for food as well. That's maybe more important. And also a second consequence is that you are using land, you're deforesting the land at the same time. You're using water, nutrients, a lot of efforts to grow this food. And that makes it that finally what should have been sustainable is not really sustainable. And finally, a last property is that what we mean by biofuel nowadays is ethanol and biodiesel only. And that means, in other words, a very small portion of what you would call the needs for fossil fuel. We are not talking here about other types of fuel. We're not talking about heating, cooling, about plastics in general, about all the different usage. So these different root causes mean that at the end, what we think is what biofuel is it expensive. It's not very attractive at the moment. And among all those different criteria, we found three, which we thought were really structural. Something that, well, basically, you cannot just solve by getting better at it, by investing more, or by providing subsidies, for example, from regulatory bodies. So we selected those three, and then we tried to think again, well, how could you solve those issues, considering we are now at the end of the S-curve? And then we thought, well, let's look at disruptive technologies. What could happen to solve all that? And we found two trends in the future. The name is kind of logical, but it doesn't tell much. So let me tell you in a few words what it is about. The first is second generation of biofuel, and it tries to address one of the issues that we have talked about, the land and food competition. How do you do that? Well, first, instead of using the part of the plant that you would be otherwise using as food, you just use the rest. Second thing, forget food altogether. You are growing plants that would grow on land that otherwise you would not have used, on non-arable land, or not economically productive land. And finally, well, our society is producing a lot of organic waste, whether it's from our household or from our industries. And all that can be used to make fuel. It can be very valuable. Then we look at another trend, which is the third generation of biofuels. And this one, on the contrary, aim at solving the two other issues: increasing the yield, make it more productive, and substitute itself to all the other usage that we have for oil in our society. This is based on algae. In fact, this is not talking about seaweed. It's not going to impact the sushi industry, don't worry. It's microalgae. And what it produces, or what people would like it to produce, is something called biocrude. So that's just basically crude oil, but instead of taking it from Saudi Arabia, Texas, or the North Sea, you will just be producing it from these little tiny green things. And what that means, in other words, is that you will feed this liquid directly into the existing infrastructure, which we talked about, the ones that are expensive to replace, the refineries, and then you get all the byproducts you want. That sounds fantastic. And on top of that, you can do that with a much higher yield. So this gray square is what you need to cover half of the production of the need of the United States for petroleum with soybean. And the little green one, that's what you just need with algae, if it works. So that all looks fantastic. If we think about what we drew before, well, normally, if those two generations of biofuel manage to disrupt the market, we will solve some of the main problems that we have seen. And for example, we think that the second generation of biofuel could be more scalable. So you would increase, in other words, the production that is currently stagnating. That's a good first step. Then the second one, look more at the right of your graph. Again, you have higher yields. You have a whole substitute to other products of oil. Higher efficiency, less land. In other words, well, suddenly the market becomes more attractive. You'll notice one thing, though, a lot of question marks everywhere. And what that means is simply, well, we don't know if it works. That's a big, big question for the future. So we have a first generation of biofuel at the end of the S-curve. We want to jump to another one. We've talked here about technological things. Now let's think about external factors. We have competitors, in other words, oil. And the oil prices could be a big driver. On the other side, we have substitutes. If you have a battery for your electric vehicle, forget about all that. You don't need biofuels anymore, at least for vehicles. External factors like geopolitical tensions. If Mr. Putin and the European Union keep having strong disagreements, well, that could obviously be a big push for biofuels, for example, in Europe. And finally, all the stakeholders could be pushing for or against what will happen in the future, whether it's incumbents, new players, public opinion. Obviously, we are talking here, for example, about GMOs. We are talking here about future jobs and the regulatory bodies. So we looked after that about signs of whether this was going to happen in the market nowadays. And what we found is recently, very much this year, a lot of players have started producing on large scale second generation biofuel. So in other words, it sounds like the future, but it could already be happening now. Not that this is planned production. And in fact, the numbers here are still quite tiny compared to what is being produced nowadays. So this is not very big yet. Here are a few pictures, and what you can see also is names like DuPont. So it's quite big players involved in this market. By contrast, for the third generation, well, what we found is a much earlier stage of development. We have big names partnering with laboratories or with small startups. Some of those big names, some of those startups are disappearing, exiting the market, because they do not think, in fact, this technology will be viable. At least maybe it's not ready yet. On the contrary, others have managed to start producing, at least in small scale. So it could be the future in 5 years, 10 years, looks like this, or like this. Now, we are talking here about jumping an S-curve, but where does the other S-curve stand? We looked at the second generation of biofuel, and we think it is right at the start of the growth period. We think it's going to expand a lot in the future. And in fact, what we have seen also, as an additional factor, is that regulatory bodies in the European Union, in China, in the US, are starting to look at incentive, especially for these particular types of biofuel, or are including a huge portion of their targets for energy for the next 5 or 10 years for those biofuels. By contrast, the third generation of biofuel is a question mark. We are still at an early stage, and so we are not sure whether it will gather the momentum to move forward, or whether in fact it will be replaced by something else. It will not be competitive. So, why am I telling you all that? Maybe your business is not oil and gas or anything, but as I said, energy is important for you. So we've looked at the different business units that are involved in this market, and we found that it's not only traditional players who are involved in this. If you look upstream, what do we see? We see strain development, we see crop protection, biogenetics. That's a lot of words that sounds like those players, crop science players. And indeed, they are very involved in what's happening in the future. Now, we look downstream. We see refining. And then we think, well, you know what? Refinery companies, unless they are vertically integrated, have a supplier which supplies them with oil, which is, as we said, not very secure and with highly volatile price. So they have a big incentive to diversify. And some of those players, like Neste Oil, have been also investing in biofuels. Now, maybe your company is dealing with food. Maybe you have a restaurant chain, like your McDonald's. Maybe you, Nestle, you deal with food science, or you have a supermarket chain. And then you're producing organic waste at some point, and at the moment it's not valued, or not valued very high. Maybe you could turn it into fuel with those new generations of biofuel. So you could be involved in that. And then, if you think about users, many of your industry could be manufacturing products with byproducts of oil, for example, plastic. Or your products could be running on oil already. And that means you have an incentive in controlling the price of oil and in understanding what's happening in those industries. And finally, maybe your products also are using a lot of energy, if you're in metallurgy, or maybe you don't think that it relates so much to you because you're selling things to the final consumer, and it does not really involve oil. But at the same time, you have to think about one thing. The consumer behavior depends on its purchasing power, which is driven by two aspects, among others: food prices and energy prices. So it could be that whatever happens there has some impact on a lot of business and the competitiveness in a lot of countries. Now, you may also be a banker, an investor. And then, well, you know what? This could be a fast-growing market, something that takes off very quick and requires investment. And what we found as well is, in fact, some players are already investing in that. And we think it's quite a good idea to think about it. So, in this presentation, what I've done is that I focused on a tiny part of the broad field of energy. We focused about one possibility, one energy future, and we have plenty of others. We have barely brushed on what everybody talks about nowadays, renewable energy. And that's what we would like to do in our workshop. We would like to think about renewable energy, and not this time nothing about technology, but more about business models. How is renewable energy and other trends in the energy industry impacting new business model? How can a lot of new players, currently not in the energy industry, make the best of those opportunities? So we look forward to seeing you in our workshop. We will discuss first a bit more about biofuel. If you have questions, if you disagree, if you think differently or have different ideas, please be welcome. And also we will look at electricity decentralization and the new business model involved with it. Thank you.